In this video I'm going to show you how to replace the diaphragm gasket, which is situated between the carburetor and the petrol tank. Now, the number one problem I've come across on this type of lawnmower is that the diaphragm gasket will wrinkle up inside here and you will get the effect of hunting with your lawnmower. Basically it will go vroom vroom vroom. If you can get it to start at all, it will rev up and down, it'll probably run for a couple of minutes and then just die. Either that or you won't be able to get it started at all. So to replace the diaphragm gasket, we need to start by taking a flat-headed screwdriver and just undoing this screw at the top and simply removing the air filter. Now, for the purpose of the video I've just removed the engine cover. It's not something you specifically need to do. So the next step is to remove these two bolts. Now you have one here and one on the front, and with those two removed we should be able to take off the petrol tank and carburetor from the main part of the engine. So what you need to do is just take a socket. It's normally a 13mm or a 1/2 inch, they're different sizes depending on the model number, and just take your socket and we'll just undo this bolt. It's quite a long bolt out of here. Okay, that's the first one removed. Now occasionally you have to move this metal bar which has got a spacer in. We'll just take that and put that out of the way to one side. Now on the front part of the petrol tank, of course, there's another one that wants undoing. Luckily for me, that's already slack and I can get to that one with my fingers. So with those two parts removed, we'll move on to the next step. So with the two bolts removed, the next thing we need to do is just pull the petrol tank away from the main part of the engine. Now as you can see here, this is where the governor link's attached to, so we need to keep our eye on that. But what we basically do is just ease the petrol tank and the carburetor away until it falls down. Now the easiest way to do this, as you can see at the top there's a little link here, is to just push this link out from the bottom, and basically you will then have the petrol tank and carburetor nicely removed from your lawnmower, so we can start some work. But before we do that, I just want to show you what most people will get wrong. On the back of the carburetor there were two rubber washers here, as you can see, and they need to fit snugly when we put this back together on the back of this carburetor. There's a white one and a black one, as you can see there. Most people will forget about those, push it back on, it won't form a good seal and it will cause revving up and down once again. You'll have the same problem. So just be aware that when you take the carburetor and petrol tank away, just to remove these two rubber washers, keep them in a safe place for when we put this back together. Now with the petrol tank and carburetor safely off the lawnmower, all we need to do now is remove the 5 screws, as you can see in the top of here, as I've started to do. Once they're nice and slack, the carburetor should pull away from the petrol tank. Now as you can see here, This is the diaphragm and gasket. Now on the top is the gasket, and what sits underneath is the thinner one, which is a diaphragm. Now these can be sourced very cheaply on the internet under Briggs and Stratton diaphragm and gasket. They're normally under about a pound each, something like that. Now I can tell this lawnmower hasn't been running correctly because inside here we have a lot of fuel. Now this should be completely dry. Now what happens is, as your carburetor sits in here, it basically picks up the fuel and it should deliver it straight to the lawnmower. It should basically burn it off as it goes along. So what we need to do with this is replace the diaphragm and gasket. Obviously clean out the stale fuel that's in here, or the old fuel that's in here. Don't blow this out, by the way, because it could blow back into your face. Just take yourself a cloth or some paper that's not going to come off in bits. Don't use tissue paper because you get bits. Just drain all this old fuel out of here. Make sure, give it all a really nice clean out. And if you're not sure if you've got stale fuel in the petrol tank, it may be worth replacing that as well while you're at this stage. So definitely clean this out. Make sure you can see right down to these little diamond shapes are nice and clean in here. Make sure the whole area's nice and clean and nice and dry. And what we'll do next is we'll put a new diaphragm and gasket on. Now before I replace the diaphragm and gasket, it's just worth mentioning that it's worth giving this a clean off before you remove it from the petrol tank, because all the dirt and debris can get underneath if you're trying to clean it off without it off the tank. So before you remove it, if it's very dirty as this one is, it wants a good clean up. But for the purpose of the video, I've just taken it off to show you how to replace the gasket. Now inside here you can see there's a little spring which you definitely don't want to lose, and there's also the pickup tube which has a filter on the top and another filter here. Now there's often times when you'll replace a diaphragm and gasket and get the same problem with the lawnmower revving up and down, and that's quite simply because these filters may look clean but they're not. There's a very fine hole in the bottom of this. This tube sits in the bottom of the petrol tank and basically sucks up the fuel into the carburetor, and it's sort of got a very small hole to get through, and if it isn't perfectly clean, the engine won't get enough fuel and will therefore run rough and then stall. So what you need to do is just take yourself a little wire brush or a screwdriver, just scratch the ends of them and make sure they're perfectly clean. Also with this one, you may just want to use some carb cleaner. Get yourself some and just give them a spray up. Make sure when you hold them up to the light, you can see perfectly through this one. This one actually just slides off like that. So if you hold it up to a light, a fluorescent light fitting, or any bright light fitting, just make sure that it's perfectly clean. So slide that one back on. Now this pickup tube does actually come off. It's quite difficult to get off, but basically it's just a push fit. I'm not sure if it'll come off just as I try it now. It won't, but if you get a pair of mole grips, just pull it off and you can actually look through the end of this tube. And if you look back that way into the light, making sure there's no fuel in it, of course, we don't want anything in your eyes, you should be able to see there's a little hole at the end of here, and if you can see through the hole and it's very clear, then you know that the pickup tube is clean. So you may need just some mole grips just to pull on that, but it does just pull out. It's just a push fit. So the next thing that we're going to look at is just putting the diaphragm and gasket back in, but it's definitely worth doing that while you've got it apart, because if you don't, you could have further problems when you put your lawnmower back together. Now here I have a diaphragm and gasket. Now the diaphragm is the thinner part that sits against the metal, and the gasket sits on top. Now what happens when your lawnmower's been revving up and down is this gasket tends to wear out. The diaphragm all gets wrinkled on the bottom and lets petrol in. Eventually it will perish. It will cause your lawnmower to let a lot of fuel into here and rev up and down. So with every repair I do, I always replace the diaphragm and gasket. It generally takes me less than 5 minutes to do now. I've done it so many times. So with a new diaphragm and gasket, all you need to do, the diaphragm is the thinner one, as I've said, at the bottom. Lie them on top, get them nicely lined up, make sure you've cleaned out everything to do with the carburetor and all the petrol tank, and make sure it's nicely dried out. All you need to do is just pop it on there, make sure it's nice and straight. With a nicely cleaned up carburetor, put some carburetor cleaner through all the pipes, through everything, clean everything right off as good as you can get it. All you need to do then is just pop your carburetor back on and slide it back on. Now the trick to the next part is, as you can see, the screw holes need to be perfectly lined up with the diaphragm, so just spend a little bit of time looking in from above before you put the screws back in, and just make sure it's lined up really nice and neat. and make sure there's nothing hanging out of the edges, and make sure everything's really nice and clean before you pop this back together. All you need to do next is pop the screws back in, and we'll have a look at reinstalling this back on the machine. So now with the screws replaced, it's time to replace the washers I told you at the beginning of this demonstration. Now the black one simply goes in first. You just pop this one in. It's easy to do it on the carburetor rather than trying to push it on the pipe on the machine. So you just pop the black one in, making sure it's really snugly fit right at the back. As you can see, that's seated nicely. And then the white one is a little bit firmer. Just pop that in. Now a lot of people will forget to do that, and they'll replace the diaphragm and gasket and pop it back together and still have problems. So it's worth taking them off at the beginning, making sure that you put them somewhere safe, not losing any of the parts. And now we can reinstall this back on the machine, knowing that you're going to get a good seal. So now all we need to do is replace the carburetor and petrol tank back onto the mower. Now as you can see, I've already refitted this little link here, which goes to this governor flap assembly. So all we need to do now is take the petrol tank. As you can see here on the top, there's a tiny little hole here, which is where the other half of the link wants to go. So all we need to do is pop that into that little hole there. It just pushes in, as you can see there. Now I'll try and turn this round so you can see it a little bit better. Basically, this top half of the link fits on the governor flap assembly, and the other half of the link pushes into the top of this plastic part here. Now this is why I was saying the washers are important. When we turn this back around, the first thing we need to do is just realign this boot here, like a rubber boot that goes onto this pop here. A rubber boot that just goes back onto here. We'll just pop that back on, and as you push it all back together, you are therefore getting a nice seal, and the washers are in the correct place to put this back together. So with that in the correct place, we need to take our spacer that we took off at the beginning. We'll just pop that back in there. Sometimes a little bit fiddly just to get back in. We'll pop the bolt through. Just needs easing away a little bit. Pop the bolt through. That will hold it in place. Just start that one off. There we go. Pop the other bolt in at the other side. Get all this nice and level. Don't do any of them up before you've got them in and got them started tightening up. So once those are tightened, you've got the carburetor and petrol tank replaced back onto the engine. Tighten everything up, make sure your governor springs are in the correct place. These ones are a bit tatty, by the way. I'm going to replace these ones. They've all got little bits where people have had a go at it, and it's amazingly it is running okay. So that's how to replace the diaphragm and gasket on your petrol lawnmower. Something you're definitely going to want to do if you're buying and selling lawnmowers for profit. Simple to do, takes less than 5 minutes once you've done it a couple of times. Just to outline the steps again, undo the 2 bolts and remove it from the springs. Make sure you've got hold of these 2 rubber washers on the back. Undo the 5 screws, replace the diaphragm and gasket, making sure everything's cleaned off and everything's dry, and the chamber inside this part of the petrol tank is nice and dry. Put a new one on, pop it back together, hook your links back in, this top one first and then the bottom one, which goes onto the plastic part at the back of the carburetor. Slide it all into position, pop the bolts in and tighten it up. Once you've done it more than 2 or 3 times, it will take you less than 5 minutes to do, and I doubt very much whether you'll have a lawnmower back within 2 years for a repair.